I'm sorry, but your reservation has been canceled effective immediately. The words felt like a slap across my face. I stood in the foyer of the Willow Creek estate, my hands still clutching the folder of seating charts and vendor contracts. Sunlight poured through the arched windows, catching the sparkle of the chandelier overhead. Like a cruel joke. I swallowed hard, my voice dry. See, canceled? What do you mean canceled? My wedding is in 3 weeks. Ms. Marjorie Ellis, the venue manager with her perfect bob and even more perfect disdain, didn't flinch. The owner has decided to terminate all upcoming events. I wish you the best of luck finding another location. I looked around at the rows of mahogany chairs already set up for the afternoon tour. This place was supposed to be my dream. My parents' only blessing after years of conflict. The place where Jake and I would start our life together. Instead, all I heard was the soft rustle of papers sliding back into my folder, the echo of my heart breaking in the silence. My name is Emily Carter, and I have always believed that if you work hard enough, life eventually makes sense. I was 29, a marketing manager in Seattle, and the daughter of 2 people who could never agree on anything, except that I was the one thing they'd done right. Growing up, my parents' marriage was a long, slow unraveling. Arguments in the kitchen over money, silent dinners with knives scraping against porcelain, and slammed doors echoing down the hall. When they finally divorced, I was 15. My mother, Patricia, poured herself into her interior design business. My father, Richard, disappeared into a new marriage and a bigger house across town. The one place I found peace was in small, beautiful spaces, rooms that felt intentional. I think that's why Willow Creek meant so much to me. It wasn't just a venue. It was the promise that something lasting could be built even when everything else fell apart. I first visited Willow Creek Estate 2 years ago when Jake and I were only dating. It was a Saturday in early spring. We were just wandering through the neighborhood when we saw the iron gates open for a wedding tour. I still remember the way the cherry trees draped over the drive, petals drifting across the cobblestone like confetti. Jake squeezed my hand and whispered, "Someday, when it's our turn." I had never dared to believe in someday. But that afternoon, something in me shifted. When Jake proposed last December, I already knew exactly where I wanted to get married. My mother, surprisingly, agreed to help cover the deposit. "Consider it an olive branch," she'd said, pressing a cashier's check into my hand. "If you're going to do this, do it right." It felt like the first true moment of unity in years. I threw myself into planning. Every weekend was consumed with vendor meetings, cake tastings, and design boards. I would sit in my small apartment at night, going over details, linen swatches spread across the coffee table, emails open on my laptop, the faint glow of my engagement ring catching the light. Sometimes I'd think of my grandmother, Eleanor, who taught me that beautiful things were worth fighting for. She used to say, "A good life isn't something you're given, it's something you claim." I held on to that as I signed contract after contract, each signature a small declaration that I was ready to build something lasting. But even as everything came together, there were hints that not everyone wanted to see us happy. Marjorie Ellis was the kind of person who seemed to look straight through you unless you were wealthy or important. Every time I visited the estate, she found some way to remind me that we were on a strict payment schedule or that other couples were eager to book the date if we slipped up. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just her way, professional, brisk, maybe a little cold. But a few weeks ago, I overheard something I wasn't meant to hear. I'd come early to drop off the final payment. As I walked past Marjorie's office, I heard her on the phone, her voice low and tight. "Yes, I know it's unorthodox, but she doesn't really belong here," she was saying. "She's not our usual caliber of client." Something in my chest cracked. I stood there, hand gripping the strap of my purse, heart hammering. For a moment, I thought about walking in and confronting her, but I didn't. I turned and left instead, trying to convince myself it didn't matter. I told Jake about it that night. He pulled me close, pressing his lips to my temple. "Who cares what she thinks? We're paying like everyone else." I nodded, but the seed of doubt was already planted. And now, Standing in that sunlit foyer with Marjorie's perfect smile slicing me open, I realized this was never about policy or scheduling conflicts. It was about power. About who deserved to have a dream come true, and who didn't. I walked out of Willow Creek Estate that morning with my folder clutched to my chest, feeling like I had just watched my own future collapse in real time. But somewhere beneath the hurt and humiliation, a small ember of something else began to glow. Defiance. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I promised myself I wouldn't let her decide my worth. I spent the next 48 hours in a haze of panic and humiliation. My inbox overflowed with polite but pitying emails from vendors who had heard about the cancellation. The florist offered to help me find a new space. The photographer said she could reschedule if necessary. My mother called twice, her voice clipped and businesslike as she suggested a country club her friend owned. I barely heard any of it. Instead, I lay awake in the dark, replaying every moment inside Willow Creek. The way Marjorie's lips had curved into that delicate, satisfied smile. The way she'd refused to meet my eyes when she handed me the cancellation notice. It wasn't just a business decision. It was personal. On the third morning, I got up before dawn and made coffee in the silent kitchen. My engagement ring gleamed on the counter where I'd set it down, as if even it were too heavy to wear. I sat at the table and opened my laptop. I started searching for anything, any clue as to why she'd really done it. It didn't take long to find the records. Willow Creek Estate wasn't just a venue. It was a struggling business. Hidden behind the polished marketing was a web of loans, lawsuits, and deferred maintenance. The deeper I dug, the more I realized Marjorie had been trying to keep up appearances for years. I scrolled through property records until my eyes burned. That's when I saw it, an auction notice buried in a court filing. The estate was in pre-foreclosure. My heart jolted. I read the notice again and again, trying to understand. If the owner defaulted on their loan, the bank would repossess the property in less than 60 days. That's why she'd canceled my reservation. She knew she couldn't guarantee the venue would even exist by my wedding date. Rather than risk exposure, she'd simply erase me from the books. I leaned back in my chair, heart thundering. A strange calm settled over me, almost like clarity. This wasn't about me being unworthy. It was about them being desperate. Suddenly, a memory floated up. My grandmother Eleanor, sitting at the old kitchen table with her hand wrapped around a chipped mug. She used to say, "When someone slams a door in your face, you build a bigger door." I closed my laptop. That afternoon, I took the train across town to meet with my friend Caroline, a real estate attorney I'd known since college. She listened quietly as I laid out everything: the canceled contract, the foreclosure filing, the auction date. When I finally stopped talking, she tapped her pen against the folder. "You know," she said slowly, "if you had the capital, you could buy it." I blinked. "Buy it?" I repeated. "Yes," she said. "Buy the entire estate. You'd get it for less than market value. You'd own the venue and every booking with it." My mind reeled. The idea was so audacious, it almost didn't make sense. But then, somewhere deep inside, I felt that ember of defiance flare into something brighter. Caroline reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "I know you, Emily. You can do this." I took a slow breath, feeling the shape of my fear, and realizing it was smaller than my conviction. I spent the next week liquidating the small inheritance my grandmother had left me, pooling savings with Jake, and securing financing. My mother was stunned when I told her what I intended. "You can't be serious," she'd whispered, her eyes wide. "You're going to buy the venue that humiliated you?" "No," I'd said calmly. "I'm going to buy the venue that tried to break me." On the morning of the auction, I wore a navy dress and my grandmother's pearl earrings. My palms were damp as I signed the bidding paperwork. Marjorie was there, too, her face pale as she scanned the crowd and finally spotted me across the room. Our eyes locked. I felt something shift between us, as if all the months of shame and anger had distilled into a single moment of clarity. When the bidding began, I raised my paddle without hesitation. 1.8 million, I announced, my voice steady. Gasps rippled through the room. Marjorie turned to her lawyer, her lips moving soundlessly. There was a moment, just one, where she looked at me and I saw it. Recognition. I wasn't the girl she could dismiss anymore. I was the woman buying the very ground beneath her feet. The hours after the auction blurred together like a dream I couldn't quite wake from. I sat in the back of the courthouse conference room, signing documents with Caroline by my side, her steady presence anchoring me to the reality that this was no longer just an idea. I owned Willow Creek Estate. When the final papers were notarized, I pressed my thumb against the embossed seal. The weight of the past few weeks settled across my shoulders, heavy but somehow exhilarating. Caroline looked over the folder and smiled. It's done. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I thought I would feel triumphant, but what I really felt was calm. I had taken back control of my life, inch by inch. The first person to confront me wasn't Marjorie. It was Jake. He met me in the parking lot, pacing beside my car, his hair ruffled from the wind. The second he saw me, he crossed the pavement in 3 strides and pulled me into his arms. Are you okay? His voice was thick with relief and bewilderment. You really did it? I stepped back and searched his face. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like certainty. Yes, I whispered. I did. Jake let out a breath that was almost a laugh. He rested his forehead against mine. God, I love you. The following morning, I arranged a meeting at the estate. When I arrived, the air was cold and brittle with early spring. The cherry trees hadn't bloomed yet. The cobblestones were damp from last night's rain. Marjorie was waiting inside the foyer, her arms folded tightly across her chest. As I walked through the entrance, my entrance, she tried to paste on her professional smile, but it cracked around the edges. Emily, she began, voice careful. I realized there have been misunderstandings. I studied her. The same polished bob. The same pressed blouse. But her eyes betrayed something I hadn't seen before. Fear. There weren't misunderstandings, I said quietly. You lied. You humiliated me in front of my vendors. You canceled my wedding because you assumed I didn't belong here. Her lips parted. You don't have to explain. I cut in. I read the filings. You were protecting yourself. But you did it by destroying something important to me. Marjorie shifted, searching for a foothold in the conversation. Emily, please. The estate has been in my family for 3 generations. I was doing everything I could to preserve it. I tilted my head. And now you're going to help me rebuild it. Her composure slipped for the first time. Excuse me? You heard me. I set my bag down and pulled out the deed, laying it flat on the reception desk where she had once signed my cancellation. I'm keeping you on for now, because you know this place better than anyone. But let's be clear. You will answer to me. Her jaw clenched. I don't think. That's not a request. I held her gaze, refusing to look away. A long silence settled between us, stretching out like a chasm. Marjorie's eyes flickered, her voice dropping to a whisper. This was my family's legacy. And this is my future, I said evenly. You try to take it from me. Now we'll see what happens when you work for the woman you underestimated. Behind her, the assistant manager, Lily, a young woman who had always been kind to me, shifted nervously. I turned to Lily, softening my voice. I'd like you to stay as well. You've always been professional with me. That counts for something. Her eyes widened. Thank you. I appreciate that. Marjorie said nothing. A few hours later, I walked the grounds alone, breathing in the quiet. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of what this place had meant. The gardens I'd once dreamed of walking through in my wedding dress. The ballroom I had imagined filled with family and laughter. Jake arrived as the sun began to set, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed me one and wrapped an arm around my waist. So, what happens now? He asked. I leaned my head against his shoulder. Now, I said, we make it better. The next weeks were a flurry of meetings and plans. I called every vendor who had left me apologetic voicemails. Each one I invited back, promising them the business they'd lost. I met with architects to plan renovations. The roof needed repairs. The gardens had been neglected. But for the first time, the problems felt like possibilities. The hardest conversation was with my mother. She came to see the estate 3 weeks later. She stood at the front gates, her eyes scanning the grounds. "I can't decide if you're brave or out of your mind," she murmured. "Probably both," I admitted. She glanced over, her expression softening. "You know I'm proud of you, don't you?" I blinked, surprised by the sudden heat in my throat. "I didn't know," I whispered. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "you should." She reached for my hand, and for the first time in a long time I let her take it. Not everything was perfect. There were days when the bills felt insurmountable, when Marjorie's clipped tone tested every ounce of my patience. But every time I walked into that foyer, the same one where she'd told me I didn't belong, I felt stronger. I had built something no one could take away. And every time Marjorie looked at me, I could see the truth she would never say out loud. I had won. Spring melted into summer as if the land itself was determined to honor the second chance I'd claimed. By June, the cherry trees had finally blossomed. Their branches stretched across the main drive, forming a canopy of white petals that drifted in the warm breeze. I spent long hours overseeing the renovations. The cracked tile in the ballroom was replaced with polished oak. The rose garden, choked with weeds, now bloomed in neat rows of coral and ivory. Every morning, I walked the grounds with a cup of coffee, breathing in the newness. How different everything felt when it was truly mine. But some days, the weight of it all pressed down on my chest. The debts were real. The risks were real. More than once, I lay awake in the dark, wondering if I'd been reckless, if I'd let pride steer me into ruin. It was on one of those nights that Jake sat beside me in bed, his hand tracing idle patterns along my arm. He whispered, "I know you're scared, but you haven't failed. Even if none of this had worked, you'd still be the bravest person I know." I closed my eyes, pressing my cheek to his shoulder. "You don't think I'm insane?" I murmured. He laughed softly. "Of course you are. But you're my kind of insane." We decided to set a new wedding date. Not out of spite, not to prove anything to anyone, but because it was ours to reclaim. I sent out fresh invitations. Ivory cardstock, simple lettering. Emily Carter and Jake Donovan. Together with their families, request the honor of your presence. No apologies. No explanations. Just a quiet statement that this time, nothing would stop us. 2 weeks before the wedding, I met Marjorie in the main hall to finalize vendor logistics. She stood by the windows, arms crossed, the late afternoon sun striping her face in gold and shadow. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, finally, she exhaled a brittle sigh. "I underestimated you," she said quietly. I studied her carefully, feeling a flicker of the old ache. "I know," I replied. She turned to face me fully. "I don't expect forgiveness." I nodded. "I'm not offering it yet." She winced, but she didn't look away. "But I will offer you something else," I added after a moment. Marjorie's brow furrowed. "A chance to stay," I said, surprising us both. "You know this place better than anyone, and it deserves someone who loves it." Her eyes glistened. "You trust me," she whispered. "I didn't say trust," I corrected gently. "But I believe in second chances, even when they're hard." Her shoulders sagged, as though some ancient burden had finally slipped off. "Thank you," she murmured, voice raw. I nodded and walked away, feeling an unexpected lightness. Sometimes grace felt like the only victory worth claiming. On the morning of the wedding, I rose before dawn. I stood in the empty ballroom, the soft hush of early light spilling across the polished floor. The scent of garden roses drifted in from the terrace. Everything was ready. When my mother arrived, she paused in the doorway, her eyes going wide. "Oh, Emily," she whispered. "It's perfect." I turned, smoothing the front of my dress. "It's ours." She stepped forward, her hand brushing my cheek. "And you built it." For a moment, neither of us spoke. All the old hurts, the unspoken regrets, seemed to dissolve in the golden light. Later, as guests began to arrive, I saw Lily, Marjorie's assistant, moving confidently among them, guiding people to their seats. She caught my eye and gave a small, proud nod. I felt the same ember that had carried me through foreclosure filings, late-night anxiety, and the hardest conversations of my life. I'd turned my humiliation into a foundation. I'd turned loss into something worth celebrating. When the music started, I took a deep breath and stepped into the garden. Jake was waiting at the altar, his smile soft and sure. As I walked toward him, the wind caught the petals from the cherry trees, swirling them around us in a gentle storm. We exchanged vows beneath the archway I'd once thought I'd never see again. In that moment, there was no bitterness left, only gratitude. Gratitude that I hadn't let someone else define my worth. Gratitude that every choice, every risk, had brought me here. After the ceremony, guests gathered in the ballroom. Laughter rose and fell against the high ceilings. Champagne glasses clinked. The band began to play our song. I caught sight of Marjorie, standing near the back. She didn't approach, but she lifted her glass in a small, solemn salute. And I nodded, because this was how you ended a war, with an open hand instead of a closed fist. 3 months later, the estate looked almost unrecognizable. The renovations were finally complete. The old roof had been replaced, the gardens replanted in sweeping arcs of hydrangea and lavender. Even the ballroom felt transformed. Light poured through spotless windows onto gleaming floors where so much tension had once pooled. I'd painted the walls a soft dove gray. A fresh start for every couple who would walk through those doors after me. The morning sunlight streamed across the reception desk, my desk now. I stood there flipping through bookings for the next year. Business was booming in a way it hadn't in decades. It surprised me how much joy I felt helping other brides plan their celebrations. Instead of resentment, I felt a quiet pride. One afternoon, I walked into the garden where my grandmother's photo now hung in a small frame on the trellis. She would have loved this place. She'd always believed beauty and purpose could live side by side. A good life isn't something you're given, it's something you claim. I pressed my palm against the frame, smiling at the memory of her voice. Jake found me there a few minutes later. He wrapped his arms around me from behind and rested his chin on my shoulder. "Hard to believe this used to be the place that almost broke you," he murmured. I leaned into him, breathing in the familiar warmth of his cologne. "It's the place that made me," I said. He kissed the side of my neck. "And now look what you've built." We stood there in the stillness, the wind stirring the leaves above us. Later that day, I hosted the first bridal open house under my ownership. Dozens of couples toured the ballroom and gardens, their voices full of wonder and excitement. I watched them from the edge of the room, remembering what it felt like to be in their shoes, hopeful, terrified, determined to create something beautiful out of the unknown. Marjorie was there, too. She'd agreed to stay on as events coordinator, and though our relationship would never be warm, it had settled into something respectful. She approached me as the last guests left, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "You've done well," she said, her voice quiet. I studied her face, searching for any trace of sarcasm, but there was none. Only something that looked almost like relief. "Thank you," I replied. A long pause stretched between us. Then she nodded once, as if we'd finally reached a truce neither of us could have imagined months ago. After she walked away, Lily came up behind me, beaming. "I still can't believe you own this place," she said, shaking her head. "It's like something out of a movie." I laughed softly. Sometimes it feels that way. That evening, Jake and I sat on the veranda, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The sky blazed pink and gold over the rooftops. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. I thought about all the nights I'd doubted myself, all the mornings I'd woken up convinced I was in over my head. "No," I said finally. "Not for a second." He nodded, as if he'd known that answer all along. The next morning, I unlocked the doors to the ballroom just after dawn. The air smelled of fresh paint and roses. Sunlight spilled across the floor in a golden tide. I walked to the center of the room and closed my eyes, letting the quiet sink into my bones. It wasn't just a venue anymore. It was a testament to resilience, to self-respect, to the idea that no one else gets to decide who you are or what you deserve. When I opened my eyes, I saw a young couple standing hesitantly in the doorway. "Hi," the woman said, her voice shy. "Are you open for tours?" I smiled. "We are," I said. "Come on in." As they stepped inside, I felt something shift, like the final piece sliding into place. This was my legacy. Not revenge. Not triumph over Marjorie. But the quiet conviction that I had taken something meant to break me and turned it into something good. Something lasting. Later that week, my mother stopped by with a basket of flowers for the office. She set them on my desk, studying the photos I'd framed. My wedding day, the renovation, the staff lined up in front of the new sign. "You were always so stubborn," she said with a wry smile. "I prefer determined," I replied. She laughed and pulled me into a hug. "I'm proud of you," she whispered against my hair. And I know she would be, too. I closed my eyes, imagining my grandmother's hands, her voice, her unshakable belief in me. When I stepped outside that evening, the breeze carried the scent of fresh blossoms across the courtyard. The cherry trees were in full bloom, their petals drifting through the golden air like blessings. I paused at the gate, turning back to look at the estate one last time before heading home. It was no longer a symbol of humiliation. It was proof that even in the wreckage of your plans, you can find something better than what you lost. A place to begin again. I took a slow breath, feeling the peace of that realization settle deep in my chest. Then I walked to my car, the last light of the day spilling over the gardens, and drove away, knowing I had claimed my future, one impossible choice at a time.